Hello, everyone in American government and politics. I'm going to put up a very quick video about Chapter 1. Chapter 1, I think, lends itself to a very quick review by me, and some students seem to like to have these little video synopsis or reviews um, put in a video form. Hear me talk, hear me basically outline what I think is important. I used to put these up uh, and they took hours and hours and hours to do because I was never happy with how they'd come out. And I'd edit them and I'd change them and I'd scrap them and start all over. Not anymore. I just want to treat it as if I was walking the classroom and I was having a discussion with you and I was going over what I thought were the salient or important parts of the chapter that I think you should know just as a student or going towards those student learning outcome objectives that we have for the class. Sometimes because I feel very awkward in front of the camera. I might miss very important information. So don't take this as gospel perfection in terms of the review of the chapter material, but I do try to hit the high points. And sometimes I can be a bit jerky, jumping back and forth when I realize, geez, I didn't talk about this other aspect of the chapter that I thought was very, very important. So I don't edit these, I don't redo them. I just want to get them done and up, and I try to keep them short. But those of you that know me, and some of you had me for many other classes, I just can't. I tend to bloviate and go on and on and on and on, and I apologize for that. But I'm going to try to keep it tight. The first chapter, I think, is trying to get you excited about civic engagement and participation, and trying to frame what it means to be a government. What is government, and how are different forms of government established throughout the world? So just to start off with, we're going to define what government is. And the book does a nice job defining it right in the very first sentence. It says, the term government describes the means by which a society organizes itself and allocates authority in order to accomplish collective goals and provide benefits that society as a whole needs. Some people say, well, that's not at all. It's selfish. People get involved in government to help and aid themselves or their allies or their friends and families and their associates. That's the elite theory of politics. I don't necessarily buy that. I think most people that enter into civic engagement and civic life and serve as political officers in our government, hopefully is trying to do the best for the most within our society. But it's a government of limited resources. We only have so much in terms of assets, and how we should distribute those assets is what government has to determine in order to keep society functioning and not have chaos. When I was in college, I had a few friends that were actually anarchists. Unfortunately, they get a very terrible name. Anarchists suggest that we're going to be throwing Molotov cocktails into a crowd and create all kinds of turbulence. But anarchists in the sense that they didn't like structured government. They think people should be free and completely on their own to determine how their lives should be spent without any other government rules or interference or laws. Those things basically curtail our freedom, and therefore there should be a world without government in terms of a utopia, a great society. But what do we know? We know that your freedoms might well invade into my happiness and my comfort level and in my success if not given certain parameters and rules and structures in order to live with a certain degree of predictability and safety and processes in order to meet life's goals. We have to have some structure. The book, I think, does a disservice, though, in discussing the different forms of government that are out there and distinguishing very clearly between governmental forms and between economic forms. And I think that's very important because many of us get confused when we hear of socialism, communism, and terms like that. Those are economic forms of the way in which capital and industry will be structured. The form of government is not necessarily indicative of the economic form they have. Unfortunately, we've developed a connotation with such things as communists. If there's a communist economic structure, it therefore must be also totalitarian in a form of tyranny. That's not necessarily true. It can be actually a democratic form of government in a communist economic system. So I want you to try to get more disciplined about distinguishing between the economic form of government that economic form of structure that a society has between that and the government. Well, what do we have in the United States of America? We are often just thought of simply as a democracy. Big mistake, thinking it's just purely a democracy. Pure democracy actually would relate and boil down to mob rule. The popular opinion wins. Whatever is in the majority is the law and is the entity that will control outcomes. We actually put certain safety measures in to make sure that those who are in the unpopular position, those are in the minority view, will also have a say in our society and will also have their interests in their fundamental rights protected, because we thought some things are so fundamental to all humans that they're going to be protected even if they are in the most minute realm of plurality. They're the very small groups. Like the book gives an example of atheists. Atheists at the time of the writing of this book, at least based upon polling, suggested to be around 7% of the population. Does that mean they don't have fundamental rights to exist as atheists and have the same fundamental rights to seek education, use the roadways, be able to buy a home, get a job, and not be discriminated against because of that religious identity? And the reality is in our society, we have protected minority viewpoints and minority status with regard to certain fundamental inalienable rights. And that's that famous term from both the Declaration of Independence and in the United States Constitution, that we do have a recognition of certain inalienable rights. They just simply can't be taken away by our government, even if the government's in majority. So what do we have? We have a form of democracy. We have a filtered form of democracy. Pure democracy would be what? Every decision that government has to make would be brought out to the population, and the population would make the decision. It's too difficult to do that. We have to have a form of government that allows for some degree of efficiency. And most people laugh at that because we think our government's very inefficient. And I would agree, it is very inefficient. But it would be much worse if every decision that we would have to make collectively as a people were brought to the people every single day for every single little minor decision up to very major decisions. So we created what we call a republic. Our form of democracy is a Republican form of democracy. And I don't mean Republican Party in terms of party politics. Republican means it's representative. We rarely directly make decisions as voters in terms of public policy and in terms of governance. We vote for our state representatives. We vote for our federal representatives. We vote for our president. And some parts of democracy are shielded from that popular opinion sort of mechanisms, like the courts. The federal courts are not picked directly by the people, and they're not even really predicted just seamlessly by one part of the elected body, meaning the President of the United States doesn't pick the judges directly. They pick them, but they have to go through a Senate approval procedure. So that's a checks and balances we put in our democracy. And in fact, our democracy is more democratic now today than it ever has been. What do I mean by that? Well, at one time, it was really only white, fairly wealthy males that could participate in civic engagement. Those people could vote and pick the representatives that would go to either Boston at the State House for state government and on the federal level as well. Very narrow democracy. And in fact, it was a very limited democracy. Women couldn't participate. Certainly African Americans couldn't participate. Native Americans couldn't participate. The poor couldn't participate. In the very early part of a republic, even people that weren't part of the Congregational Church or the Puritan Church might not even be able to participate. There was actually religious standards that were often in play in our very early part of our country. So I know that stuff's boring. You guys don't like to hear it, but we do need to recognize our form of government. So what do we have here in the United States? We have a Republican form of government, or a republic, which is a representative form of government. When we recognize that, we see that there's a filtered process. And one of the great questions I like to put up in the discussion board is, okay, we vote for somebody to go to represent us in Congress, for example, on the federal level, but we're representatives from our state. We vote for them. And let's say the popular view here in Massachusetts is the tax rate should be reduced. And then our representative goes to Washington. So if they know that 70% of the citizens back home want a tax cut, should our representative do that? Or should our representative do what they think is in the best interest of society and say, well, a tax cut couldn't be wise because we have certain military spending, certain healthcare spending, certain spending needs for education that need to be provided for. And if we give a big tax cut, that will undermine certain fundamental things in our society. So I'm not going to go along with the popular opinion. That's the big debate we still have to this day in representative government. Should our representatives do what the will of the people is? Or should they do what's in the best interests of the people? And that's the big debate. And most politicians, I know it's going to sound terrible, flip and flop depending on the view. For example, if I was sent to Washington as a congressman or congressperson, I would like to think I'm going to vote my conscience all the time. But sometimes a political question might come before me that I don't really have a very strong personal opinion about. And I'll say, well, what do my people want? What do the people I represent want on this decision? And I'll do what the popular will is. Other times, if I'm in Washington, a decision on law might come up, and I might say, I don't care if 90% of my people back home have that view. I think it's morally or ethically or fundamentally wrong. I'm going to vote my conscience. And those of you that know me a little bit know I'm a political junkie. I mean, that's artwork for me. That's not office stuff. I'm in my home right now. I threw a tie and a shirt on, but I collect political memorabilia. I love politics. I'm immersed in it all the time. I'm not interesting because I tend to be a centrist. I'm kind of in the middle of the road politically, but I love politics and I love talking about it all the time. And one of my favorite books was written by John F. Kennedy back when he was a senator from Massachusetts. It's called Profiles in Courage. And he gets in to that very question. Do our politicians or should our politicians represent what the popular will of the people is in a democracy, or should they do what's in the best interest of the nation and of their communities? Because they can be very different. And I forgot how many actual famous politicians he uh, did bios on, and basically he did bios on politicians that did what was unpopular, costing them pretty much their political careers, but doing what they thought was right. But that's the dichotomy we have in a representative government. If our representatives were only supposed to do what was popular, well, we can just basically vote electronically on how every law should be passed. And if it was just by popular will, it would revert back to mob rule. We want some filter there. We want our representatives to hopefully be a little bit more knowledgeable about laws and proposals that come up. And that filter that our framers of our government designed early on, I think, was a bit ingenious because it takes away a little bit from the emotional mob rule mentality of a pure democracy. Pure democracies almost never work. The only one that I give an example of is Athens. And the reason why Athens, Greece, back BC time, like way back when, why did it potentially work for a period of that time there? They were a homogenous group of people. They were all of the same economic, or most of them were of the same economic standing. They were mostly of the same race, the same religious views, the same philosophy, and it was a very small community. There, maybe a pure democracy can work. Our system is a pluralist system. We have different religions and races and ethnicities and sex and sexual orientations in economic standings, that there are too many different interests out there, and we need a filter through good representative government. And I don't think it always works, but think about it. We have, up until recently, been able to have a nation of laws that we follow legal principles, and the laws have largely worked to make our society the best in the world. Certainly not imperfect, but we've come a long way. Is there any form of direct democracy that we still have in our country? Yeah, we'll get to that later chapters. But those of you that live in small communities like I do, I live in Brimfield, and just before Brimfield, I lived in Sturbridge, where I was a selectman. We actually have direct democracy there on some of the local decisions, like, are we going to buy a new fire truck for 150 years, like $500,000 for a new fire truck, a pumper truck? And it'd be controversial, because the citizens don't want to spend that kind of money out of our tax dollars. And we'd actually go to something called a town meeting, where we'd vote directly. The citizens of the town that were registered to vote would come in and vote, and it wasn't anonymous voting. You'd actually have to vote, and people would see you holding up in favor of a proposal to buy a new fire truck or not buy a new fire truck, or buy some new ball fields from some vacant land to create soccer fields, and it might cost us a greater tax rate in the community. That's direct democracy. So we're a mixed democracy. On some levels, it can be a bit direct, and occasionally we do something called referendum on the state level, or initiative on the state level, where our representatives in government won't take a position on a proposed law, and the people will do it directly, like recreational marijuana. That was not a law passed by our legislators. It was passed directly by the people through initiative and referendum. I'm getting way off track, but I just want you to get a little excited about the different forms of government. And one thing I'm going to add now that the book doesn't have, other forms of government. The book does talk about an oligarchy. An oligarchy is when power is concentrated in a handful of powerful people, or powerful families or businesses actually control the government. Some might argue that Russia is a democracy, but others would argue it's actually an oligarchy controlled by a handful of political power players in either a political party or from a family. There, it's a political party. The Communist Party in Russia really controls who's going to get elected and who's going to be making decisions in that country. That's an oligarchy. One thing the book doesn't get into, they don't even talk about a monarchy. There's still some monarchies in this country, and that's basically the rulers are determined by a bloodline. The king's kids and they become the queen or the next king and things like that. Very rare now, but at one time in the world's history, monarchies were very prevalent and powerful. We still have also something called theocracies that I want you to know about. That's where governments are run largely by their religious leaders. They might not do it directly, but they do it indirectly because you have to seek approval by the theocratic leaders, the religious leaders in that sovereign nation. And sovereign means that's that power. Where does power come from? And what's beautiful about the United States, and a lot of people don't believe it, but it is actually true if people will actually take power, is that power is derived from the people. That's why when we read the Constitution, the first three words are "we the people," in order to perfect a more perfect union. It's the power stems from the people. That's not a novel idea entirely because it was in Athens, Greece, but it's a novel idea in terms of modern countries being run by the people. We're looked at, I think, with admiration usually throughout the world for the fact that the power does get derived from the people. The people decide how we'll be governed, and if we don't like it, we have mechanisms within our Constitution to change it. So I know I'm a bit rambling today, but the first chapter is really dry as hell. And those of you that watch this video, hopefully you'll have a moment and say, thank God he sees it that way too. But they do talk about different forms of government. Democracy, direct democracy, which we don't have. Indirect democracy, which is the Republican or representative form of government, which we do have both on the federal and the state level. In fact, all states must have a Republican form of government. And I'm not talking about the Republican Party. I'm talking about representative government. And that's the problem with terms that mean different things in different contexts. Talked about oligarchy, talked about theocracy, talked about monarchy, and we should talk about dictatorships in autocracy. Autocracy and a dictatorship, kind of basically the same thing. Leadership in one person or one family or a small group of individuals, very similar to an oligarchy. And most people think when they hear a dictatorship or an autocracy, we often think it's brutal, that any dissent is not tolerated. And that's often very true. But there have been some nations in history that have been run by a dictator or run by an autocracy, basically this unquestionable rule, but the society has functioned well. People had a certain degree of autonomy and a certain degree of economic well-being, and the communities thrived. So when you hear that a country is led by a very powerful autocracy or tyranny, or don't say tyranny. Once you say tyranny, then the gig is up. The tyranny is obviously brutal, and the rule is controlled by fear and violence and threat of incarceration. But some autocracies and some dictatorships can actually be somewhat successful. And I know I sound like a heretic when I say that, because none of us really believe that in the American culture, that a dictatorship or an autocracy can ever be good, because we like that concept of power coming from the people. So we automatically assume that an autocracy or a dictatorship must be cruel and abusive. And it's not always. It could be a benevolent dictatorship where it's trying to do what's best for the people, but all the power is in one individual, and there's no rule of law that dictates how he or she needs to run the country like we do have in America. And some people say, well, that's been questioned recently. Yeah, it's been questioned, but what do we always come back to? We do come back to the Constitution as a fundamental guiding principle, in that no one man or no one group of individuals can really dictate how this country goes when the will of the people gets exercised. And when it does, we tend to honor it. It's been a little shaky recently, but for the most part, it's kind of come around to recognize the rule of law as being the most important concept within our nation. And who decides what our laws are? We do, through our representative form of government. And if we get dissatisfied because it goes too far one way or the other, we can remove our politicians through voting, and we can change the laws if we find them unsatisfactory to our sense of justice and fairness. It doesn't always work. And now the rest of the book really gets into talking about public good versus private goods. I'm also concerned about knowing common goods. Those terms I don't think are that critical. Different types of government, majority rule. Although we have a majority rule, we do have what, again, is a prophylactic benefit for those that are in the minority. I often find when I'm on some issue that's going to get voted on, I'm on the losing side. Well, if I'm on the losing side, does that mean I'm going to get thrown out of the country or get incarcerated or have my property rights taken away? No, there's certain benefits and protections for those basic and inalienable rights that we've decided as a society that even if you're in the most unpopular positions, your right to voice that objection, your right to believe those things, and your fundamental rights to carry on in the society as a free person will largely be maintained. And that's still true to this day. direct democracy. There is some direct democracy here in the United States, and it's usually on the very local level, like town meeting, town warrant, and sometimes on a state level through that initiative I talked about. We'll get to that later in the later chapter. The book gets into this whole philosophical thing about elitism versus pluralism. I do think that people that have money and wealth and power tend to be able to dominate politics on some level. I'm into politics. I've run for office before. I occasionally toy with running for office again, and I recognize that you can't do it without political power through money and through connections, or you're at a huge disadvantage of getting into power. There's no question about it. But I also recognize we're a pluralist society. It's not all run by the elites. There are different interests in society that must be dealt with, and if they gain enough traction and enough organization, they can really move the world. I mean, at least the political world within the United States. There's no question about it. Many of you probably don't know who. That should be your homework assignment. I shouldn't give you that little nonsense question. Tell me who your state representative is here in Boston. Tell me who your state senator here is in Boston. Tell me who your governor is, your lieutenant governor. Tell me who your select board is or your city council members are. Most of you probably don't know. That's okay today, but by the end of the semester, I'd like to think you start taking a little interest in civics and know who these people are, because you'd be surprised that if you, especially if you and a handful of other people, got together and made some phone calls or wrote some letters on some issue, you'd be surprised that if you get enough people to do it, and I'm not talking a huge number, you might actually get a response from these politicians, because they usually, not all of them, but most of them probably want to do what's best for their citizens and want to respond to their complaining. I guess it's not always complaining. Sometimes it's about, hey, we need to do something about this issue. We need to get things together. But let's face it, there are all kinds of tensions within our society. What your goal might be very contradictory to what I want. It might be in direct contradiction. That's pluralism. Your views actually might contradict directly with mine. And we're hoping that through governance and through the rule of law and civility, a certain sense of professionalism and how we look through all these problems, we come up with a solution that satisfies as many people as possible without degrading those that are in the minority view. It does a pretty good engagement in democracy. Since I was a little kid, my father took me to all kinds of political events. I used to say he was grooming me to be some kind of politician, and I think he was, actually, in hindsight. I love politics. I love all forms of politics. I love all political parties. I know that sounds weird, but my father was a very, very if you ever hear the term Machiavellian politician, Machiavelli was an Italian philosopher, I think Italian philosopher about political power, and he says, hey, any means necessary to basically take control and take power. So my father would actually take me to political events for multiple candidates running for one seat, and when I was coming of age, getting a little bit more aware, I remember telling my dad, I said, Dad, aren't these 4 people that we went to these different fundraisers, sometimes all on the same day? He said, aren't they all running for the same seat? He goes, how are we supporting all of them? He goes, they're all good people. I want to get to know them all, and I want them to get to know me. And he believed in that to some degree. He wanted to know who all these different potential players were, and he wanted to donate to every one of them. Back then, he donated cash, and it was probably not reported. I don't know. He wasn't trying to avoid reporting, but you wonder what the politicians did, because now if you do a certain amount via check, other politicians can actually look at the record of who donated to whom. And one of my friends not too long ago sent me a nasty email and says, I can't believe you donated so much money to some politician, because it's all part of the public record. Because although we have freedom to donate money to whomever we want in terms of political activity, we do require a certain amount of transparency in who's donating what, because we want to know who's influencing our government officials. And so engagement in democracy, I'm really engaged because my father kind of brought me up that way, and I really caught the bug. I remember going and voting with my dad since my earliest memories, 4 or 5 years old. We always would go vote together. I didn't get to vote, of course, until I was 18, but I used to always go with him, always voted, always participated in that kind of part of civic engagement. But I also, I've been a selectman in a town. I've run for office. I've been involved in different political campaigns of different people in the past. I love this stuff. The problem I think we have, and I think some of you want to address it in this class, and I hope you do, is the rancor, the polarization. We've come so far that no longer do we disagree upon principle and try to work to resolution. We now think that the people that disagree with us are evil, and they probably think we're evil. And we've gotten so far into rancor and anger and hatred that I think it's really, really detrimental to the fabric of our society as a whole. And some people go back in history and say it's always been pretty bad. And that's true. Even back to John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. These guys would actually hire people to insult each other in the news press. they were called seditious libelists, and they would go and write nasty articles about each other. So and they became close friends much later on in life. But we've always had some degree of rancor because you're a pluralist society and you're fighting for limited, resources and means and position. And of course, there's going to be some rancor and being upset. But the people as a whole have usually been much more geared towards resolution and compromise, and I think a lot of that's lost now. And I think many of you feel that today. Certainly, what's going on in the American country. So, pathways to to engagement, all kinds of ways you can get involved in politics. Doesn't have to be political parties. I know that troubles me a great deal. Some of you might look me up, find out what political party I'm in. Well, if you look up my history, I've been involved in both of the major political parties and also unenrolled many times during the last 20 years because my father raised me as a Machiavellian. That if I thought I had an advantage being a Republican, I would sign up as a Republican Party. If I thought I had an advantage or a role to play in a Democratic Party, I'd be in the Democratic Party during that time. That's probably hurt me in terms of my reputation in party politics, but I'm not a big fan of party politics. But I recognize that's how things are often done in political realms, is being involved in party politics. But there's other ways. There's all kinds of unions, social groups, and clubs. They sound like they're just clubs, but they are what? They're advocates for positions regarding law. Some of you may have kids and you want to advocate for better schools, or maybe you want to advocate for growth of charter schools, or maybe you want to advocate for better standards or no standards in terms of testing. Who knows what it is, but there's all kinds of ways to get involved in civics. And I urge you to do so. It sounds boring and it sounds trivial, but you'd be surprised how people who had no interest in this stuff at all of a sudden got a cause, got an interest in something, and then they got involved in civic engagement, and they can make changes. And you really can, because where does the power come from? The people. And if you have a good position and a strong position, and you can get allegiances with other people, you can make changes. There's no question about it. So factors in engagement, I think the book does a pretty decent job on this kind of stuff about who's more likely to be engaged. The more educated, the wealthier you are, the more likely to be engaged. But that's not an absolute by any means. There's plenty of poor people, but let's face it, poor people are struggling with putting food on the table and keeping a roof over their head. How can I possibly care about political stuff in my community, in my state, or my federal level when I got to worry about making sure my kids don't, aren't facing danger or getting through the school year, half on Zoom and half at home, or half in the classroom, and all those other issues. So there is a certain degree of argument that I think is valid, that there is a bit of elitism in our civic engagement world, that those who are wealthy, those that are older, and those that are educated tend to have, more active involvement in civic engagement. I think that's unfortunate. But the good news is the most recent voting cycle, at least voting is a form of civic engagement. The voter turnout was very high in the national election, and that was a good sign. Not necessarily who won or lost, I'm not commenting on that, but just the participatory level was way up. So who governs? Elitism, pluralism, trade-offs, engagement, and democracy. Everywhere you go, you should be engaged and don't feel like you can't. I'll just give a quick example. I went 30 minutes. I was hoping to go 10. I was thinking about my brother who just retired from the city of Springfield, and he went one night. I wish I was there for this because I heard the story. It was great. He's not political at all. He doesn't know what the political parties stand for. He has no interest in all. He just wants to golf and enjoy life and be left alone. But he was working for the Department of Public Works. He's an electrician, something. He used to fix the city lights, the signal lights, and work with the engineers on timing of those lights and stuff. And he was down at City Hall, and there was a big budget issue, and their contract was up, and so was the police departments and the fire department. And the police got up, and they wanted some 5% raise of, next 3 years, 4, 5, and 5. Each year, that's what the raise would be to their base pay. And for some reason, the DPW people wanted something like 2, 3, and 3. And the police officers, when one of the first spokesmen got up and said a few words about the cost of bread, the cost of feeding their kids, and the cost of keeping their kids clothed, and paying for a decent home, and all that kind of stuff, is prohibitive, and we need this, raise of 4, 5, and 5. So my brother, for some reason, which he's very apolitical, he decided to go that night to this big meeting at City Hall. And he got up there and goes, well, the DPW is asking for 2, 3, and 3. He goes, do our prices of bread and milk and housing somehow get discounted somewhere? How come we're not getting 4, 5, and 5? And I guess all the DPW guys kind of went nuts at the town hall and were like carrying my brother out on their shoulders, and they were hooting and hollering, and the place kind of went into bedlam with the recognition of the inequity of of that political question. Where is the budget going to go and who's going to get what piece of pie? And it turns out that year, not because of what my brother said, but the DPW guys kind of got a little bit of an awake moment, if you will, and they recognized that they were getting kind of screwed. Their base pay was much less than the police department, anyways, and they were only getting a percentage of that base pay. Everyone got the same raise that year, and my brother came out of here a little bit, and my brother goes, "What the hell happened? What did I do?" He didn't recognize but he spoke his mind on a very simple issue, and he captivated civic engagement in a rarefied moment, and it's a beautiful moment. And that's one of the things when we talk about the Constitution and about the Bill of Rights, and especially the First Amendment, freedom of speech, and the right to petition our government, so powerful. And we take it for granted. We really do. We really do take it for granted. But anyways, I'm the political junkie. You don't even have to watch these videos. I just put them up trying to summarize what I think are the key aspects of the chapter. What is government? We define it. I think Barney Frank used to be a congressman out of the Fall River area, Massachusetts. He says, government's whenever a bunch of people get together and decide what to do for the best of the community. That's one of the ways. That's a positive spin on government. Other people think government's basically the way in which we get controlled, the way in which we get our liberties limited by. Because let's face it, the government does have to do that sometimes in order to keep structure and stability within society. So there's always that tension going back and forth. What is government? Who governs? The elites, pluralism, trade-offs, and the engagement in democracy. Get engaged. And one of the things I used to give extra credit for, or if I'll give extra credit for, but I'll be very pleased if you go and register to vote. You can black out or block, but show it to me. Maybe I will do that as an assignment if you haven't registered to vote already. Show me you're registered to vote, and you can black out what party affiliation is if you're uncomfortable with that. I have no objection to that at all, because that is a private bit of business, but everyone should enroll to vote, and everyone should participate in voting. And I know I love it very much. But anyways, see you guys later. Hopefully, give me some feedback on these videos. If you hate them, tell me you hate them. I don't want to see another one in the rest of my life. But if you like them and you want me to keep doing, I'll keep trying to keep up and do them for each chapter as we go for each week. Otherwise, be well.